Hello, my name is Jacob. We're here once again as part of Threshold Education's Oxbridge application series. This is the first of several videos on the admissions tests. And today we are going to be talking about something called the TSA.
Yeah. So, Jacob, first of all, what is your experience with the TSA?
Yeah, so Threshold Education, the company that we're both the directors of, have helped a lot of students with Oxbridge applications. We've got about 100 freelance tutors working with us, many of whom went to Oxford and Cambridge, some of whom were even admissions tutors at the universities and have a lot of experience helping students. And I personally, I went to Oxford. I studied PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics, and I did the TSA myself back in 2011. And since then, since I graduated, I've been working as a full-time professional private tutor and running Threshold Education. And I've helped maybe 4 or 5 students make successful Oxbridge applications, taking them through the entire process, including the TSA. I've also provided special masterclasses in training pupils at certain independent schools in London for the TSA. So I've been working with it professionally for quite a long time, and of course did it myself.
Perfect. So, plenty of expertise on the TSA.
I hope so.
Yeah. So, first of all, just very briefly, what is the TSA? What is an introduction to the TSA?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so the TSA, the Thinking Skills Assessment, this is an admissions test used by Oxford and Cambridge for a couple of different courses, and also by UCL, University College London. So at Oxford, applicants who are applying for any of these subjects have to do the TSA. So these are PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics, philosophy and linguistics, psychology and linguistics, psychology and philosophy, economics and management, experimental psychology, and human sciences. If you're doing any of those subjects, you are going to have to sit the TSA. For Cambridge, it's just one subject. It is land economy. You will sit the TSA if you're applying for land economy. And for UCL, there are 2 courses: European Social and Political Studies and International Social and Political Studies. So, in terms of what is involved in the TSA, well, as the name suggests, the thinking skills assessment, it's meant to test your ability to think. And there are 2 ways, broadly, in which that's done. We'll go into more detail in a moment, but it tests both your quantitative, so kind of numerical thinking, and also your ability to understand logic and arguments. So that's pretty much what the TSA is, and it will take place after your UCAS application is done, but before the interviews.
Okay, excellent. And so we know who uses it, and is there a particular reason why they use this test as opposed to individual tests for subjects? Or
Yeah, yeah. Well, those subjects are all general kind of social science subjects, kind of between. They're not really natural science. They're not hard science, so-called in that sense. They're not STEM subjects. They're also not um, full-fledged humanities like English literature. They're kind of subjects which, as one of my tutors said in my first year, are truth-seeking, but don't necessarily have a fully fledged, agreed upon methodology for finding that truth. Hence, philosophy is meant to be, the love of wisdom. They're seeking truth. It's not like English literature when arguably truth isn't the point. Um, it's subjective. Philosophy is not meant to be subjective, but we can't really agree on what the answer is. So that's generally that kind of subject, that middle ground kind of subject, where you need to be systematically logical and reason in a coherent way, but there's still a lot of room for individual initiative. And that's why I suppose thinking skills are so important for all of these subjects. And it's easier to have just one test to test those skills than to have individual tests for every single combination of subjects of that type.
great. So testing their thinking and the candidate's thought process.
That's right.
And so moving on, what is the exact structure of the test, the TSA?
Yeah, good question. So the TSA has 2 parts. So part one is the biggest part. Part one has sorry, 50 questions. These 50 questions come in two types. So 25 of those questions are problem solving. So problem solving questions are kind of mathematical questions, but they're not really testing how much maths you know. Certainly A-level maths content's not on there. A lot of GCSE maths content isn't even there. It's just about how you can use logic to work out how to figure out a certain problem involving numbers. So it's not the complexity of the maths, it's how you get to the answer with the information they're given you. The other half of the questions, the other 25, are critical thinking. And these questions, they give you a written passage and they ask you to analyze the argument, right? So an argument in this sense is something like Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. And that's a good argument because it has to be true if the premises are true. If the two things that prove that conclusion are true, then it has to be by logic. So the arguments are basically like a paragraph, and you have to kind of work out what the underlying logic of that passage is. And we'll look at, there are different ways they do that. There are, in fact, 7 different ways those types of question can work, but they all have that in common. You're working out the underlying logical argument in a text. The problem-solving questions divide into 3 types. Probably the most important one to know right now is that about a third of the questions, the test is just whether you identify the relevant information. So some of the information is just irrelevant, and you've got to identify what that is. And yeah, and then regarding the other 2 types, you will have some questions where it's figuring out what maths you have to do that is the issue, and others where it's more about identifying patterns, and that might include shapes and graphs and so on. Yeah, that's pretty much the structure. Is there anything I've missed in the structure there? So, oh yeah, so 50 questions and 90 minutes to answer them. So that means you've got about 1.5 minutes per question, leaving a bit of time at the end. And they get harder throughout, but not in a simple, like, linear way. So there'll always be a bit of random variation. The 2 types of question, problem solving and critical thinking, are evenly mixed throughout. And finally, of course, there is section 2, which is a 30-minute exam. You only do this one at Oxford. Cambridge applicants won't do it. And this is 30 minutes where you write an essay. So it's simply a marked essay, and you pick one essay on a pretty general topic from a choice of 4. And yeah, I think that covers the whole of the structure.
Right. Thanks very much. So how will the candidates be marked on?
Right. Well, that's a really good question, yeah. So, so there are 2 sections of the TSA, unless you're applying to Cambridge. Most TSA takers, of course, will be applying to Oxford just because of the huge range of subjects that do it. So out of these 2 sections, they're marked separately. And section 1 is divided into 2 for problem solving and critical thinking. And that's also marked separately. So you end up with 3 scores, and they're all standardized. So the scores are scaled to be out of 100. Now, exactly how they scale them is a little bit unclear. It's not quite like taking a percentile. So if you get, for example, 10 out of 100, doesn't mean you were on the boundary of the 10% weakest candidates exactly, but it's something a bit like that. We don't know exactly the formula they use. But very roughly, if you get something like, say, 40 out of 50, your scaled score is going to be in the low 70s. If you get, say, 48 out of 50, it's going to be just over 90. Okay, so those last 2 marks make a big difference. So they scale your scores. You're going to have separate scores for problem solving, critical thinking, and the essay. Now let's disregard the essay for a moment. It's actually slightly less important. But then taking those 2 scale scores for section 1, they will group you into a band, okay? And there are 4 bands from 1 to 4. And very approximately, I think that to get into band 1, you need about 80. Yeah, about 80 out of 100 as an average across the 2 sections, across those 2 scores. And band 1 is guaranteed interview. Now, band 2 is probable interview, and I think you need about 70, okay? So in terms of marks, that means to get a guaranteed interview, you need about 45. And to get a probable interview, you need about 70. which is about 40. Yeah, so 45 and 40 are roughly the thresholds. They vary a bit each year. Yeah, so that is pretty much it. That is how they use the TSA to decide if you will get an interview based on those 4 bands. Band 3, by the way, is probably not an interview, and then band 4 is definitely not. So you have an outside chance if you get a score between around 30 and 40, depending on other parts of your application. Yeah,
Okay.
and then after the interview, they combine it with the interview itself. They also give that a score out of 100 to decide on the final application. Yeah, and the essay, by the way, so that's also used, but it seems to have a little bit more flexibility. You need to get a score above about 65 to have a really good chance of getting an interview, but it makes less difference. So that's 65 out of 100. The problem with the essay is we really don't know how they mark it. We have really only like vague ideas, but I can tell you from my experience, 65 is a competent essay, but nothing special about it. They're not A-level style questions, but if we're talking like an A-star kind of A-level quality essay with good grammar and writing, that's going to get you something like 60, 65. So yeah, hopefully that covers the marking. There's quite a lot of information there, but we'll put some links in the description for you. And yeah, anything
Yeah.
else? Is that clear?
Yeah, absolutely. That's hopefully should be very clear. So lastly, how would you then recommend that candidates prepare for this?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say is prepare early, okay? As early as possible. So we're in June. The TSA is going to be in November. Now, you might be thinking of applying next year. So now is a good time to start preparing, but not by drilling exam papers, at least not yet. What you should be doing is slowly practicing that way of thinking. If you do something like A-level philosophy, that's pretty useful for analyzing arguments and critical thinking. If you do maths, that's going to help with problem solving. But as I said, it's not like a one-to-one map. Um, what you can do is read books. Okay, there's a list of books on the TSA website. They recommend 3 or 4. One I've found particularly useful is it's just called Critical Thinking by Stella Cottrell. That's quite good. They will help you with the sort of less familiar aspects of this. And also just read good quality newspapers. Something like The Economist is quite good because they have data as well for the quantitative part in their articles. And think about the arguments that's being made in the editorials and the possible strengths or weaknesses of it. So that's the kind of long-term preparation. And then as you get closer to the exam, just as you would for any exam, really, do the past papers. There are about 10 of them on the website, and gradually build up to doing those in time conditions, and keep doing those and checking your scores. Yeah, but that's really the last stage, the last mile.
Okay, perfect. That's all very, very good information. Do we have any practice questions that we can perhaps?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. But do we just want to discuss the? I think viewers might be interested in the actual experience on the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this will be this year on the 4th of November. The same for Oxford or Cambridge. UCL have their own assessment days, and they don't have interviews, of course, most of the time. So it's slightly different there. But this will take place usually in your school. Might be different this year. We don't know what the situation is going to be with COVID-19 at that point, but probably in your school. Um, a bit like a GCSE or A-level exam, you'll go into a quiet room with the other candidates, you're given the paper, you take it in your school, and as I said, it's the total is 2 hours, right, for the 2 sections. So yeah, it can be a fairly intense experience, but probably nothing that's overwhelming having done GCSEs, and nothing to really worry too much about. You can't predict questions, you can't do anything like that, so don't really try.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Should we move on
Yeah.
to practice questions?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I've prepared a few questions from real TSA questions, which we're going to discuss. And you guys watching this, you can have a go at answering these just as a taster. So I'm just going to show you the first one. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. So here is our first question. Tanya has two pigs. She estimates the weight of one as being 85 kilograms, the other as about 72 kilograms. She has ready access to a cheap source of potatoes, but wishes to feed her pigs a 50-50 nutritional mix of potatoes and meal. Two tables from her feedbook are reproduced below. How much meal should Tanya feed her pigs each day? Right, now this is, and I've given you a clue there, this is a relevant selection question. So the challenge here is to figure out what information is relevant. So, Dhananjay, what do you think the answer to this question might be? If you're watching at home, pause the video now and have a go yourselves.
Right.
Okay, so we've taken a little break there to have a go at this question. So, Dhananjay, what is your guess?
So I'm not too sure about this, I have to admit, but I would say, since it's a relevant selection information, my thinking was perhaps that the information on the right-hand side, that graph could be filtered out or could be
Okay.
ignored. Therefore, you're looking at simply the weights, the state of the pig, and the amount of meal to feed each day. Therefore, one pig is over 80 kgs, so that would be 2.5 kgs. And another one is between 60 kgs and 80 kgs, so 2.5 plus 2, therefore C, 4.5 kgs.
So you're going for C, is that your final answer?
That would be my answer, yeah.
Okay. So the correct answer is, in fact, A. Let's just briefly go through why. So firstly, as I think you figured out, the whole of the right-hand side table doesn't matter because we're not really interested in these vegetables. They're kind of trying to catch you out there by saying she feeds the pigs potatoes and meal, but it doesn't matter. We're only interested in meal. So we ignore the right-hand side table. Okay. So first pig is 85 kilograms. So if it's being fed only meal, it's 2.5 kilograms. But of course, only half of its food is meal. So that's actually 1.25. The other pig, 72 kilograms, would be fed 2 kilos. But again, it's only half, so it's actually 1. So that gives us 2.25. And I think that might have been the mistake you made, Dhananjay, that you went for C because you didn't halve them. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's just being very careful to read all the information and figure out its relevance, because we can see now she's feeding them only half their food as meal, so they only need half the quantity in that table. So the two together, of course, make 4.5. And that's it. That's sorry, they make 4.5, but because it's only half, right, it makes 2.25. So that's why we get A. Okay, guys. I hope some of you got that right, but don't worry at all if you didn't. It's just about familiarizing yourself with the kind of question. So we're going to go on to another question now. Just bear with me a second. Okay, so
Question 23, yeah.
all right, guys, so here's our next question. So this is a critical thinking question, and it's a question that asks us to draw a conclusion. So a conclusion is the thing that a passage, an argument in a passage, is trying to prove, the thing that's the writer is trying to prove. So in this question, the conclusion we're looking for is not in the text. It's the conclusion that would follow. So we have to figure out the argument they're making, the evidence they're using, and how they're using it, and then work out what conclusion would logically follow from that, but which they haven't actually written in the passage. So here it is. In the 1960s, the drug cardiokind, after the usual period of carefully monitored clinical trials, was declared by its manufacturers to be unusually safe and very effective in lowering cholesterol levels in the blood. The World Health Organization carried out exactly the same kind of trial on the drug, but for a much longer period than the usual 5 years. The results in 1980 showed that the mortality rate from all causes for those on cardiokind was 25% higher than for those who, though similar in other respects, had not taken the drug. So which of the following is a conclusion that can be drawn from the above passage? Okay, so once again, if you want to pause your video and have a go at this question. Okay, so I hope you've taken a minute to make an attempt at this question. So Dhananjay, what was your answer?
So once again, I was rather Unsure about this and slightly unfamiliar with the question type. I think so. I narrowed it down to possibly between B and D, and then I reached the conclusion that it might be B.
Okay, so you're going for B. Is that your final answer?
Um, yeah.
All
Uh,
right.
wait.
Well,
Uh,
not sure.
doesn't make sense. Perhaps D is perhaps a more logical conclusion. I would say
So you're going for D.
I'll go for D in the end.
Okay, let's have a look. So the right answer is actually A. Okay. Um, so let's just go through why. All right. So this passage is talking about two different trials, right? So we have this first trial, which was done by the manufacturers of the drug, found it's very safe. Then another trial, which lasted much longer than usual, found that actually there was a correlation, right? This is a big point, that a correlation is not necessarily a causal link, a correlation with higher mortality. So it suggests that there might be a causal link, but there isn't necessarily. We can't prove that. What we can, however, prove from that is that 5 years might not be long enough to know the full effects of a drug. Because in this case, clearly, it wasn't long enough to know the full effects of cardiokine. So, given that it wasn't long enough in one example, we can at least be certain that what A says is true, that it may not be a long enough trial period for all drugs. There may be effects of drugs that only become visible after more than 5 years. Now, B might look as though it follows. There's a degree of logic, but it would be a big leap. There's also a statistical difference between a mortality rate and a decrease in life expectancy. Those are not the same things. Higher mortality rate means that more people died, but a decrease in life expectancy means the average expected years of life decreased by a certain percentage. Those are different things. Now, C, again, doesn't really relate to it actually, because the deaths may have been nothing to do with cholesterol, but because of some other side effect of the drug. D, we don't really know. Of course, they might have concealed it, but it might have just been that they didn't know either, that they genuinely thought that based on the trials they'd done, cardiokine was fine. And E is also, E we also can't really assume because it seems like that's an assumption that the passage is making, actually. The passage relies on that being true. It doesn't prove it, it's not a conclusion. So if the World Health Organization were not efficient, the whole argument wouldn't really make sense. But you don't prove from the argument they must have been efficient. We just don't know if they were efficient. They could have been inefficient and found out something interesting anyway. Of course, if they were inefficient, you wouldn't even trust the new results, and you might want to do even more trials on cardiokine. So that's an assumption rather than a conclusion. So the right answer is A, and you said you were going to go for D in the end. So what was your reasoning, Dhananjay, for going for D?
Yeah, so that explanation makes perfect sense. So I think I slightly jumped to a conclusion which wasn't necessarily following
Right.
on given. So there's a slight assumption in D,
Yeah.
uh, particularly an assumption about the motives of the manufacturers. It's quite possible that they were simply ignorant of the side effects
Right.
themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. The passage doesn't say either way whether they knew or not. So it's a kind of guess. It's not a conclusion you can prove. Yeah.
Okay,
Great. Okay. So let's do one more question. Okay, so this is our final question for today. This is a question in which we have to assess the impact of additional evidence. So they give you another passage, and then they ask you, well, what extra information would strengthen, or in this case, weaken the argument? So if one of those 5 options were true, which one would make the argument weaker, would make the conclusion less confident? So the tip here, the first step is to figure out what is the conclusion of the passage, what is the thing the writer is trying to prove. The second step is to figure out how the writer is trying to prove it. And then the third step is, given that method of proof, that kind of argument, which of these statements would undermine it? Okay, they can either undermine it by showing that what we call the premises, the evidence, does not prove the conclusion, or by showing that the evidence itself is false. So there are 2 ways that information can weaken an argument. So the question goes like this. According to a recent survey, people believe that about a quarter of the population will become victims of a violent crime in the next year, whereas crime statistics show that it is only about 1%. Furthermore, those with the greatest fear of crime are the least likely to be affected. The elderly are the most fearful, although victims are more likely to be young males. Over the last few years, there has been an increase in the number of television programs which show reenactments of crimes. Though they are often done with the best of motives, these reenactments add to people's fears about violent crime by making it look more common than it is. It is time that we stopped making such programs. Which of the following, if true, would most weaken the above argument? Okay, so here it is. And once again, I'm going to ask Dhananjay the question, and you guys can pause the video and have a go yourselves. Okay, everyone. So I hope you have had a go at that. Dhananjay, what do you think?
So I went through the steps as you recommended or attempted to. So I believe that the argument that they're trying to prove is that fear of crime is not necessarily correlated to being an actual victim of a crime. They show this, I think, using actual crime statistics. And I believe the statement, which could, if true, weaken the above argument, might be possibly D.
Okay, so you're going for D?
I would, yeah.
Okay. So you are actually right. I'm not sure that your reason was the right reason. You may have been right through a partially correct reason. Or maybe I think there was a slight problem in that the conclusion of this argument is actually the last sentence. It is time that we stop making such programs. So that's the thing they're trying to prove. The reason that the writer establishes that we are overly fearful of crime is in order to prove this, because they establish that in the first half of the passage, and then with the word over, so halfway through they go to over the last few years there has been an increase. And here they then identify a possible cause of this excessive fear of crime, and that cause, they speculate, is these television programs. Therefore, their conclusion is we should remove that cause to remove the fear and stop making the programs. So that's the thing they're trying to prove. The way they prove it goes through three steps, basically. We're overly fearful of crime. The cause is the television programs. Therefore, we should get rid of the programs. Now, if we then think about these different statements, so D would indeed weaken it, because D would show that actually the programs are not the cause of the excessive fear, since the group with the excessive fear, the elderly, don't watch the programs, at least not very much. So D would weaken it. It would undermine the idea the programs are the cause of the fear. I think that's pretty similar to what you said, Dhananjay.
Similar to some extent, yeah. I think I perhaps didn't follow the argument through or reach the conclusion that the author was trying to get at.
Yeah, we managed to get it right in the end anyway. So I guess like generally, if you're not sure about any of these questions, it's always best to have a go and make a guess. You don't lose any marks getting it wrong, but of course you can't get marks if you don't attempt it, and you have a 20% chance of getting it right. There's often, one that's obviously not right anyway, which raises the chance even more. So just to go through the other answers, so A wouldn't really weaken it. A might actually strengthen it. It might strengthen the argument that these television reenactments are causing the fear, since they're so realistic. B would not really weaken it. B might again strengthen it. If the elderly people don't know about the statistics, then that might actually strengthen the argument that their fear is excessive. The fear is not coming from the statistics, it's coming from something else. C doesn't really seem relevant at all, since the argument is actually completely about the perception of crime. It's not about the actual level of crime. It's just the fact that whatever the level of crime is, we fear it more than that level, and then it identifies a possible reason. D, we said is the right answer because it would weaken it, and E is not really relevant because the argument is suggesting that people are not aware of the statistics, or at least that their fear is not based on the statistics. Their fear is disproportionate. So no matter how good the statistics are, it's not really going to change their fear if you accept the argument's premises. Yeah, so hopefully that makes it clear. I mean, is it clear then, Dhananjay, why the answer is D? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That does make sense. That would weaken the argument, as the entire argument based on these programs.
Great. Yeah, well, okay, I'll turn off this for now. So there we go. So those were 3 TSA questions of different types. We had 1 problem solving and 2 critical thinking questions of different types. So hopefully gives you a taster of how it is. If you got 2 or more of those right, you're doing very well. If you didn't, don't worry, because there's plenty of time and it's just an introduction. But hopefully you enjoyed that. So that is our introduction to the TSA. And next time we're going to be looking at one of the other entrance exams. We will be doing, Dhananjay, can you tell us a bit about your subjects and the entrance exams for languages?
Yeah, so we'll be going into the modern and medieval languages admissions test for Cambridge and the MLAT for modern languages admissions test at Oxford as well, and looking at comparisons between the two and analysing writing and the different techniques that can come up there.
Okay, well, that sounds great. Well, I hope you tune in next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe and keep in touch with us. You can write a comment below this video if you have any questions or anything you want us to discuss going forward. You can share your own experiences of the TSA or any of these other exams, and I'm sure the other readers will be very interested to hear. And you can visit our website for more information about entrance exams or help with any that you might be finding difficult. That is www.thresholdeducation.com. Yeah, once again, please do subscribe, and you'll find out very easily all of the updates we'll be making in this series as we go through the different subjects. So next up is modern and medieval languages. Okay, thank you all for watching once again. Bye.
Bye.
Without an education